Welcome back to Dynasty Market Watch, where yesterday's price is not today's price. It's Matt here joining me today. We are going to go through some buy candidates for your contender teams. We're going to talk about some game theory and some strategy heading into the playoffs, whether you're a contender or you're a rebuild, or maybe you've got a team like me that's just been sitting in middle ground. I've got an interesting situation that I'll run through for a roster that I've got. But before we get to that, Matt, play that Fat Joe.
Yesterday's price is not today's price.
All right, Matt, let's run through maybe some contender buys. And as we're going through them, we might hit on some dynasty kind of strategy, game theory. But let's just kind of go through some buys that you might be interested in for a contending team, and then what we would pay for them. So what we're looking at right now is we're using the Fantasy Calc top contending targets. So if you go to research on the Fantasy Calc website, you click trade targets and it pops up top rebuilding targets, top contending targets. And then a lot of these guys, you may look at your roster and be like, or your league and be like, well, I mean, Derrick Henry is on a contending team. I can't get him. So you're kind of going to have to pick and choose and maybe find someone that just got knocked out of the playoffs. But I think the idea here being, Matt, we're just going to kind of run through some of them, give what our value buy price would be.
So you want to start with the top one is obvious. It's pretty obvious even if you don't look at the list, it's Derrick Henry.
Derrick Henry is this year's Christian McCaffrey in a sense.
Yeah. I think that's a fair comparison. I mean, I would just start at like a late one, right? Like if I'm a playoff team, I would give my first for Derrick Henry.
I've got a team. I've got a couple teams where my final slot is like, and it's maybe like a buy team, and maybe like Amari Cooper, like a Tony Pollard, where I feel a little uncomfortable with them being my final guy. And if you add a Derrick Henry, then that could be the kind of the game changer that you're looking for. So I think a late one is probably what it's going to take. I've reached out to one person that had Derrick Henry on a rebuild, and they were wanting like twice that. So I just said, well, see you later. And that's probably going to be fairly consistent if someone still has Derrick Henry on a non-playoff team. It's probably because they are asking way too much for them.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Like, so I guess what's the highest you would go? Like, let's say you have a bye week team, like you have a top 2 seed, pretty secured. You go to the Henry manager. Let's say they just fell out of the playoff race the last couple weeks, so they're not going to make the playoffs. They say your late one is not enough. Would you do a bye week first and second for Henry, or is that getting too expensive at that point?
If I was in bad shape, like let's say, unfortunately, knock on wood, we've had pretty good injury luck here recently.
I was just thinking about that. It's like you got so and so injured. I was like, who's been?
Yeah, but I don't know who's been injured. So the running backs are holding on pretty strong. But let's say I've got a fairly thin roster that's held on, and now I'm at the point of the season where, all right, I'm gonna add a little bit of depth before the trade deadline. If my Alvin Kamara went down, then I would be okay. I've at least backfilled with Derrick Henry. Would I send that late 1 and 2? The first thing that I would do is I would take that 1 and 2 and go try to get someone that I think could hold value a little bit better. Someone maybe like Christian McCaffrey. Maybe can I add even more and go get, I don't know, Kyron Williams? I mean, I would probably rather have Kyron Williams. Maybe can I just get Kyron 401? I don't know. I would definitely be looking elsewhere. But if we're in a situation where there are no other options, this is the only player on a rebuild. Our league is totally dismantled where we have a top 6, bottom 6, and there's just no other players to buy. And this guy's telling me, hey, I've got your competitor is offering me a first and a third. You can have him for a first and a second. I would probably shrug my shoulders and say yes, if I think it's going to be a difference making. So like if Derrick Henry is projected for, let's call it 17, 18, 19 points per game, if I'm going to be replacing him over top of someone projected for like 10, 11, 12, like if he's going to be just moving in and I've got a bench like Cooper Kupp, if I got to bench Cooper Kupp now, probably not, because I'm not really changing my outcome that much. I mean, yeah, I'm protected against injury, so I'm buying an insurance policy, but I'm not sure that's how I want to spend a first and a second. I think I'd probably prefer to go get something that's going to hold value if that's the case. But yes, if I'm in a situation and I've got a team like this where I will probably be starting, it's a bye week team, most points for, probably going to be starting Pollard or Amari Cooper.
I was going to say Pollard. So the two running backs I was thinking of, like Tony Pollard or DeAndre Swift, it's like you're okay starting them, but like Henry's probably going to give you 10 more points per game the rest of the season. That's significant,
Yeah, that is significant. Agreed.
So yeah, if I'm upgrading over one of them, but then at that point, I'm almost trying to throw them in the trade. Like, all right, can I give you Pollard and a first for Henry or something like that? Which they might not want to do if they're rebuilding, but
right.
It's all about, like all trades are, the easiest way to get a trade done is to put yourself in the shoes of their manager. And, maybe if they're in a long rebuild, yeah, they're not going to want Pollard. But if they're going to contend next year, then that's when you can kind of offset the difference a little bit.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is, this is going to be the case as we talk about every single player that we run through. But the biggest thing is, what is the opportunity cost that you're shedding when you jump from the previous player you were starting to this player? So, if we're talking about Derrick Henry, then I don't want to be like benching David Montgomery because I'm going to start Derrick Henry now. Like I need to be a substantial upgrade. So as we're looking at some of these contending targets, Derrick Henry, Mixon, and Alvin Kamara, the top three, I would kind of say they're all about the same to me. Do you agree with that? And B, how would you rank those three?
I think I would rank them just like you said them. I think Henry, Mixon, and Kamara. And then I'm honestly not quite sure where CMC fits into all that, because their 49ers are kind of having the year from hell. He just came back from injury a few weeks ago. I think he's still young enough where I'm not that concerned with his age. I believe CMC is 28 right now. And one thing that I'm happy about, narrative-wise, that is getting just blown the fuck up this year is that stupid like RB age threshold. Like once an RB hits 26, 27, you got to dump them because they're on the downswing of their career. I've kind of said this over the last year or two, and I've definitely thought it, that I really think that entire RB age threshold narrative comes from three guys: Todd Gurley, Le'Veon Bell, and David Johnson. Like when I was growing up, running backs in their late 20s produced all the time, like even into their like early 30s. So, this Henry season is not that much of a surprise to me. Mixon and Kamara have always produced throughout their entire careers. There was nothing really suggesting that they would fall off this year, and they haven't. You can even go to the next tier of player like James Conner and Aaron Jones. And that's kind of the same thing. Like this past offseason, like a big narrative was like, man, Trey Benson, he's got a lot of juice, like coming out of Florida State, got day 2 draft capital. James Conner's 29. We can likely see Benson take over this backfield by, week 10, week 11 of his rookie year. When really last year, there was nothing to suggest James Conner was falling off. It was just kind of people like hoping that the new sexy thing would take over. And I think that's kind of like a lesson to be learned this year where, don't just necessarily like if you're falling out of the playoff race, but you have, let's say, a couple firsts on your roster, you definitely have the roster value to contend next year. I wouldn't just dump Mixon for like a mid-second. Like, why would you do that? Because you're going to contend next year. He's probably going to produce again next year. And he's probably gonna get back to like a late one value if he's not currently there right now. I mean, he just has looked awesome every time he's played with the Texans this year. So I don't
Yeah,
see
I think
why
you
that
make a
wouldn't continue.
I think you make a really good point. And just like let's think about the dynasty value of like Bijan versus let's use Puka. Let's say that they're both worth, just for the ease of this, like 2.5 or 3 firsts.
Yeah.
The running back that let's use Aaron Jones. Okay. Aaron Jones, you can probably in the offseason get him for a second.
Yeah, I would agree.
The receiver that you're getting for a second is going to be probably damn near useless. I mean, you could get like a young guy for a second, maybe like a Pearsall. Who's the second round wide receiver that you could purchase? I mean, like in this list, we don't even have anybody in this list. I was going to say Mike Evans, but I don't think you'll be able to get him for a second. I mean, we're probably getting down to like maybe Amari Cooper, probably not.
I was going to say Cortland Sutton.
Yeah, and he's been balling,
He's been
so you
good.
probably can't get him for a second anymore. So like what I'm getting at is in the offseason, you talked about how you really weren't into owning guys like Bijan, Gibbs, Brees. And obviously they've been pretty awesome. Brees has had his ups and downs, but recently he's been pretty good. And you always shifted to these older running backs. And if you're putting more of your value into the high-end wide receiver and the low-end running back cost, I think you're utilizing your value in a pretty efficient way. So if let's say you've got 3 firsts and a second to work with, I'd rather use that on Puka and Aaron Jones than Bijan and call it like Amari Cooper.
Yeah, definitely. And one thing that I didn't really agree with you on, that I've come fully onto your side now after this season, is your disdain for the glob of wide receivers. And like when you first kind of mentioned this theory, and you're like, T Higgins, Tank Dell, Zay Flowers, whatever, like all these guys, carry a little bit more value than their production. And I'm like, I don't know, I kind of like all those guys. And you're like, that's the point. Everybody does. And
everybody loves them.
Everybody loves them. And like, so I've been kind of thinking about that, like this offseason, especially April, May, rookie fever hits, all that stuff. People just want a roster full of young guys. I bet you could probably trade Devontae Smith for Joe Mixon and Cortland Sutton. And like, if you're going to compete the next
and
couple
maybe
years,
like a second.
Yeah,
in the offseason. Like today, that sounds like outrageous to say. It just like there's just no way that's ever going to happen. But when you get into like March, April, May, when people hate guys like Mixon,
yep,
I think you could do Devontae for Mixon and Cortland Sutton, and you'd have people in the chat saying "ooh" for your side getting those guys.
Yeah, that's gross. Like, all right, it's going to be gross when they're scoring 15 points per game more combined than Devontae next year. Like,
and just to kind of, if somebody's never listened and they're wondering what you were talking about as far as like the glob wide receivers, basically the glob wide receivers were roughly wide receivers 14 through 30.
Yeah.
Those guys I just really didn't want to have anything to do with. And if we start running through all of those guys from preseason that I was considering the wide receiver glob, not many of them have been very successful.
It's been really good only T Higgins.
T's been good when he played, but he's been out a lot. He missed a couple games at the beginning of the season. He missed a few games during the middle. You've had DK. He's been good.
Yeah.
Flowers, I would say, has been solid and has maintained value. I don't know that he's been someone that I'm like moving up the boards. The only one that really jumped up and now it's softened, is Jaden Reed. Jaden Reed moved all the way up to like wide receiver 12 or so, and now he's kind of back into the glob, it seems. JSN seems to be moving up.
Yeah, JSN's on his way maybe out of the glob, but it kind of took a while.
But then the rest of them, you've got guys like Tank Dell, DJ Moore, Debo, Waddle, Ayuk, Roma Dunze, Tyreek, Olave, Devontae. All these guys have just sunk down throughout the season.
Yeah.
And yes, they've lost some value, but they've been irrelevant on your fantasy teams all year. Waddle just had his first double-digit fantasy point game all season in week 12.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the tough thing about rostering them. It's like not only are you bleeding value a little bit, but also like a guy like Waddle's a perfect example. You never feel great about benching him, so you're just putting his 9 points per game into the lineup every week and then just getting increasingly frustrated with him all year. And to the point where you might end up just selling him for spare parts because you're tired of dealing with it. Whereas last offseason, you could have got, a first and second value, whatever, turn that into whatever. But yeah, so I'm definitely coming around to your philosophy on, seeing what you can change those pieces into on a roster that kind of fits more practically with actually winning games, which is the entire point of why we play.
Yeah. So let's get back to some of these guys. So Henry, Mixon, Kamara, we're kind of valuing the same. You mentioned Christian McCaffrey in this group. My perspective would be that I would do a second. Whatever I'm willing to pay on top of for Henry, Mixon, Kamara, I would pay an extra second for CMC. Would you do more?
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I think that makes sense. He's not someone that I would want to sell low right now with the perception that he's like washed or whatever. I don't really agree with it. So if anything, I would be buying probably at his current price.
I think it's a good opportunity to buy. And it might be a good opportunity if you're a team that you're kind of we obviously got to assume that Christian McCaffrey's on a team that someone's trying to sell him. Let's say you've got a team where your pick is already set. I mean, we've only got 2 weeks left. I think there's a lot of teams where that's the case. And you've got somebody's late first. Maybe you go out and just say, hey, you want this late first for Christian McCaffrey and just see if you can get him. I don't think that just because you're a tanker, you can't acquire him. Now, obviously you're running some risk on injury the rest of the year, but Christian McCaffrey for a first, it would need to be like a plus EV. Like I need good value to be able to do it.
Yeah, so that situation actually came up in a league that I'm in where this league started this past offseason. Your brother's in this league, actually. He kind of made some beneficial trades with me before the season. He's a strong contender. But I was doing a 1-year punt, and I collected a whole bunch of draft picks, and I have a lot of good players on my team where I'm definitely going to compete next year. There's no question about that. And the guy who had Debo, he's been trying to give me like Debo and bullshit for Josh Downs over the last couple weeks. And I'm like, this isn't really close at all. And then, so he put Debo on the trade block this morning and just asked for any second. This guy is the current 6th seed. I think he's likely to maintain the 6th seed and be the last playoff team in. I have his second, and I also have his first. But so I just sent him his second back. It's probably going to be around 207, I would expect, for Debo, and he instantly accepted. And, in this league, being a 1-year punt, I was definitely not trying to buy any aging veterans. That's not really my goal. I was just going to take my draft pick haul into the offseason. But then when I saw that, I was like, what's the risk there? I do think there's a good chance Debo bounces back next year and, has at least a stretch of very productive games, if nothing else, if not a whole season. So for like Debo a few months ago was probably a late 1 value. So if I can get him for a mid to late 2 now, he's not seriously injured or anything. It's just the entire 49ers offense is a mess recently. I think, good chance they get all that corrected and look like a juggernaut again next year with a healthy Purdy and all that. So I always be on the lookout. I think no matter what your team build
Keep
is,
your antennas up because you don't know when someone is just going to ready just to kick some guys to the curb.
Right, exactly,
and that's they're ready to take it.
And that's what that trade indicates. That guy was just ready to get off the Debo train. Like if you're just going to take like a mid to late second back, then you just want off that. So I'm happy to make that gamble. I still have a bunch of picks, and I think Debo's going to be startable next year. At this point, I'm already kind of looking towards, all right, how am I going to turn these picks into points next year? Mm-hmm. And I think that's like a solid early start on it.
Okay, so we've been through 4 running backs. I think maybe the 2 other biggest trade buys or contender buys old guys would be Kupp and Kelsey. Maybe Tyreek also. Maybe we can combine Kupp and Tyreek here.
Yeah, I think Kupp and Tyreek.
So let's do those 2. Let's do Kupp and Tyreek. So you're a team we've talked about where you've got like a gaping hole in your starting lineup. Like maybe you for whatever reason you've got Elijah Moore as your flex play right now where you're like, I need to backfill this spot. What are you paying for Cooper Kupp?
I think I can't go late one on Tyreek or Cooper Kupp at this point. Like they're over 30, and I mean Kupp is producing when he's healthy, but he's had a lot of injuries, and he's clearly not the number one. Puka is the number one option on that team now.
Yeah,
and then with Tyreek,
let's level set on Kupp though really quick, just because I think it's a little bit of a misconception on how good he's been. On a per game basis, wide receiver 3-ish, kind of depending on
he's like 20.4 points per game, right? Or something like that.
He's been really good. Now this last game, he caught a touchdown, like one of the last plays of the game, which really was beneficial for him. But that's kind of what good players do. Is kind of my thought is that they score fantasy points, and we shouldn't be like complaining about how it happens. Like I keep seeing people complaining about Jackson Smith and Jigba scoring in the final 2 minutes of the half. Well, like that's kind of what good players do. Like they find ways to score, and their quarterback gets them the ball. So like, anyways, all that to be said, I think Cooper Kupp it's a little bit, he's going under the radar on how well he's performing right now.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. To me, it's just it's tough to send a late one for a guy that with his type of injury history, I would say. Like so like Kupp and Tyreek almost have like opposite type concerns, right? Like Tyreek doesn't really have injury concerns. I guess his wrist is bothering him, but I don't know if that's really a big deal. But he's just not.
That actually does concern me a little bit. The wrist thing. I don't know if it would concern me that if they get knocked out of the playoff hunt, that they're like, we're going to shut him down. Like this wrist thing's real. He's going to go ahead and have surgery.
Oh yeah, no, okay, that's a fair point.
I
was thinking more for like 2025 and beyond. But
okay, like if
like after the season, I'm still going to have injury concerns about Cooper Kupp. I'm not going to have any about Tyreek, really, not more than any old person, I guess, old player. But yeah, so I mean, both of them, I'm like, it's almost like I'm trying to use something other than a first. So like, last time we recorded, we talked about Jonathan Brooks hanging out in this like early 2+ range of value. If I have Jonathan Brooks, I would definitely send him for Cooper Kupp, or like you mentioned Ricky Pearsall a little bit ago. Okay, what can I do? Ricky Pearsall and like my second, and maybe I throw in a third also, something like that, where I'm not using a first on a player like that. That's the deal. That's the type of deal I'm trying to get done, where I use a piece on my roster that I'm not going to be using in my lineup to kind of bridge the gap of like a 2 and a 1, because I just wouldn't pay a late one, and I wouldn't really blame anyone for paying a late one for Kupp or Tyreek at this point. I just would rather I'd rather either take my chances without Cup or Tyreek or use other pieces to get a deal done.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Whereas like Henry, if I had to do a late one, I'm more confident in Henry's ability to score a lot of points and stay healthy the rest of the year while doing it. I guess I would say.
Yeah, and I do think Tyreek will bounce back and be really good next year. I think you make a good point on Cup with the soft tissue injuries that he continues to have. I think all of the guys that we've talked about so far, I still feel very good about their 2025 outlook. So Henry, Mixon, I think both of them will be kind of the bell cows for their rosters again next year. Kamara, same deal. CMC, same for him. So like I think all of these guys really bounce back strong. Cup would probably be the one where Puka continues to take more steps forward, and I don't know that we see wide receiver 3 points per game from him next year.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that he probably is the best served to sell if you're like a kind of I have a team that's a fraud contender. I say fraud contender. It's a pretty good team. But I don't see myself most likely winning it. But with that said, I've got guys on my bench that are very usable. I've got like Juwan Jennings on my bench, DeAndre Hopkins. And so I'm kind of in a position where, you know what, like, can I sell Cooper Kupp, still be kind of a fraudish contender, and just kind of get out of Cooper Kupp and sell at kind of the peak of this wide receiver 3 that we're seeing. So I think that's another kind of game theory approach that you can take as we're getting to the trade deadline. Obviously, you don't want to go into the playoffs with no depth whatsoever, and you don't want to spend all season getting to the playoffs and then just debilitate your roster. But as long as you've got like a couple pieces, I don't mind trying to sell off a couple old guys and, rolling in with like 1 or 2 depth players into the playoffs. I don't really want to go into the offseason just letting multiple guys potentially die on my roster. Unless I'm like a bye week juggernaut type roster. That might be a little bit of a different situation.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I do think that that does sort of separate some of the, I don't know how to say this, but like some of the better, sharper players in fantasy or in dynasty versus like people who I would say maybe don't overthink things. Another way could be saying don't think through them enough. But like, I do think some of the sharper players tend to look at it like that. Like, all right, I got players you mentioned. I got Juwan Jennings, I got Cortland Sutton, I got Darnell Mooney, all on my bench every week because I can't start them or they're like in competition for my last flex spot. How do I increase my flexibility going into this offseason is kind of how to look at it. And it also makes it easier where if you have 3 or 4 guys like that and you just don't know who to start every week. I have a couple teams like that. And like every week I got to bench one of those guys or Shakir or Pollard. And it's like, man, I'm just going to make the wrong start sit decision every week. Let's take a couple of these options off my table. And I'm not afraid to sell to my like competitors in the playoffs because like I really do think playoffs are just mostly luck. So like here, I'll sell you Cortland Sutton for a second and third or whatever we figure out the deal to be. So I'm not worried about that selling to like my competitors. I'm fine doing that unless it's like a really major piece. Like I'm not going to sell Derrick Henry to a team I'm going to face in the playoffs, but like I'll sell David Montgomery to him.
We talked about some of this last year, and I don't think people realize the gap that is typical between a playoff matchup. The points per game gap is like over 20 is your typical difference in a playoff matchup. I think in the championship round last year across all sleeper leagues for Dynasty, and I think one thing is that they kind of cultivate it to where it's down to like a certain style. So it's like a super flex 10 or 11 man roster PPR, but like thousands of leagues. And I want to say that the average point differential for championship matchups was like over 25 points per game. So for any of us to sit here and think that the difference of like getting Derrick Henry over David Montgomery is going to be the difference between me winning and losing a championship. It might be, but it's most likely not going to be. So that's why I said earlier, make sure that if we're buying some of these guys, you have a sizable gap difference between who you are replacing them for.
Yeah, agreed. All right. We're doing general theory here, but one player specific question that I had, because another person that we mentioned on this top contender buys is Travis Kelce. Would you rather have Travis Kelce or Jonnu Smith in Dynasty right now? On a contender, obviously.
If I'm a juggernaut team, I'm just going to roll with Travis Kelce. If I'm like I would rather have Travis Kelce either way. I don't know how much I really buy into the old Jonnu Smith thing. This seems like it could be like one of those like blips on the radar where we look back and we say, oh, remember when Jonnu Smith was killing for the Dolphins?
Yeah.
I don't know exactly what his contract is. I'd be curious on that because I could see a situation where, like, if this is a 1-year deal that he's on, where he goes somewhere else. Let's see, it's a 2-year deal, so he's
back next year.
He's back next year. I mean, I don't know how many games has this been going on where he's been good. I think that's another question to ask.
It is, the reason I asked that is because I have Jonnu on a couple teams, and he's one of the top players. If we were making a list of like, what the fuck do I do with this guy in Dynasty, Jonnu would be very close to the top of the list. Because, I mean, the first month he didn't do anything. And then since week 5, he's had an 8-point and a 9-point game, but those are his floor games. Then he's had a 26-point game, 35 points, 28. So I don't know. Like, I don't really know what to do with him. If I'm on a contender, I'm just going to kind of start him and the rest of the way until he's, starts having a couple shitty games. But, he's 29. I don't want to pay anything for him. If I was weak at contender, or if I was weak at tight end, like we mentioned, like Kincaid or Laporta or Pitts or someone that we have on a contender and we're just not comfortable with it, I think I'm okay paying a late second for Kelce. And so in that situation, I guess I would pay a late second for Jonnu, but it feels fucking gross. But
You mentioned Jonnu since week 5. You mentioned Jonnu since week 5. Since week 5, he is on a 17-game pace of 95 receptions, 1,110 yards, and 10 touchdowns.
I mean, that's nuts.
That's a 7-game sample. I mean, it's not nothing. And the last 2 weeks have obviously been really good. And Mike McDaniel seems fairly interested in getting him the ball. Like, he's addressed how, like, he likes his yak ability. I don't know. I mean, if I was in a situation, you mentioned Kincaid, you mentioned Pitts, maybe you had Tucker Kraft, and you're like I like that he scores touchdowns, but I don't feel super comfortable with him.
Right? Yeah, Kraft's another good one.
Would you pay a late second for him? I don't know. I'd probably just roll with the guys that I've got, if one of those guys that we've mentioned, and just hope that they pop a touchdown game, because it could very easily happen where he does what he did in weeks 7, 8, 9, and that's a total of those 3 weeks he had averaged 37 yards per game and no touchdowns.
Yeah.
So I don't know. If you paid a late second, I wouldn't make fun of you for it. I think it's probably what he's about worth.
Yeah, agreed. Just another alternate to Kelce I was throwing out there. If Kelce's not available, you need tight end help. And like the other one that came to mind is Cade Otton. And I think Cade Otton is kind of already, maybe like his Linsanity run might be over already.
Which might be why he's purchasable. Maybe you
can
because his Linsanity run feels over.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. So, like, this past game, he had 3 targets, 1 catch, 30 yards. But before that, I mean, he had 8 targets, 11, 10, 10. But again, Mike Evans comes back and his target total drops from like 8 to 10 to 3. He never did much before Evans and Godwin got hurt, but he is young, right? So he's only in his third season, only 25 years old. He's another guy I don't really know what to do with. I don't think he's very good. Like real life, I would compare him to like Jake Ferguson. He's just not that athletic. He seems to get open, catch the ball, and fall down a lot, which a lot of tight ends do. But I'm just not that big of a believer in him long term. So I'm not really going to pay up to get him, especially if I think that his production is going to be limited the rest of the year. But he's another one to throw out. If you don't agree with me, I think he's probably gettable right now for a pretty cheap price. And he could be another decent contender tight end buy, I would say.
Yeah, and if you're in a super flex tight end premium league, he's projected for 13.2 points. Let's say you're trying to go buy a guy to get into your flex. Like that's what Mike Evans is projected for.
Yeah.
Jaden Reed's projected for 13.5. Zay Flowers 13.7. So like he's going to be, if you're just looking for some points, just fill in some projected points into your flex spot, he's probably going to be the cheapest of any of those guys.
Yeah, that's true.
Mentioned. So just because he's a tight end and you've got Brock Bowers on your team, Cade Otton might be a decent flex move that you could get for pretty cheap.
I mean, I think that pretty much wraps up the contender buy list that we kind of went through on Fantasy Calc.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And then there's some others on there that you can take a look at. James Conner, we mentioned Mike Evans, Josh Jacobs, Kittle, if you need tight end, David Montgomery. I think that they've got a pretty good list. I think it just start rolling down the line and just kind of see if there's anybody that is on a non-playoff team.
So one thing that we can kind of transition to, one thing that I kind of struggled with this year is, so coming into this season, the way I preferred to build my contenders is to have two strong quarterbacks, don't care about QB3 at all, and then use the value I would have on a QB3 and just have the best running backs, receivers, and flexes around those two quarterbacks that I can get. And then during bye weeks, just throw in a Darnell Mooney in my super flex spot, and I'm fine with that. Or whoever my best flex is. The Dak and Trevor injuries kind of fucked with a few of my contending teams this year, and it was really annoying trying to replace them. And I know last year, if you remember back to last year, the second half of the year, we had like that QB apocalypse where like a third of the starting quarterbacks in the league died. And now I think I'm starting to kind of change my mind, and I almost think it's a better to have a Matt Stafford, a Cousins, or a Geno as your QB3, and just kind of keep them on the bench most of the year and break glass when you need them type thing. Do you have any kind of like strong preference of like putting that QB3 value towards your starting lineup, or having the insurance policy on your bench where you don't have to make a panic trade and maybe lose value to replace a QB2 that goes down?
So I've always typically had a QB3, kind of like a Stafford, a Geno, a Russell Wilson, somebody like that on my rosters. But I don't know if it's a very good use of funds, to be honest with you. So I don't know. I think it's kind of a how cheap can you get them type thing. Like if I can get a QB3 going into the season that's really cheap, and I'm just like, I mean, why not? Then yes. I think the biggest caveat though is how liquid your league is and how often are you seeing trades. Like, can I actively go out and make a fair market value trade for a quarterback if I need to? Or is this a league that's stale and like nobody will trade? Then maybe you should make sure you have one. But
yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
I typically will have one. For example, I've got on my 2 Dak rosters. So I'm in 15 leagues, had Dak on 2 contenders, and one of those rosters had Stafford. The other one had Russell Wilson. So I just slid them in. I'm not going to go buy another quarterback. I'm just going to roll with those guys in the playoffs. But at the same time, now I get to the playoffs, and do I need to go get a backfill QB3 before a trade deadline? Now, obviously, if you don't have a trade deadline, then you don't really need to, which kind of goes into why trade deadlines are good, because it helps rebuilders be able to sell off their pieces at the deadline, but that's a different story.
Yeah.
So I probably, depending on the team, like I might go out and make sure that I've got like I don't know, like a Tommy DeVito or something that's like as like a QB3 type option. I'm not going to go out and break the bank for someone. I'm not going to go tear up and try to get a Joe Burrow, but I'm going to probably have some sort of QB3 option. I don't feel as comfortable as most people do, just like sliding in a Darnell Mooney. It feels like those guys have that really low floor. Now, I mean, Tommy DeVito probably does too, and so does Cooper Rush. But I just don't feel as comfortable rolling those guys out there. Another aspect of that is I don't kind of going back to like selling off a Cooper Kupp if you've got a lot of depth. I don't want to have a team that has tons and tons of depth. If I've got several guys that can score double-digit fantasy points on my bench, I'm probably not roster constructed very well.
Yeah.
And so my teams generally don't have. Now, I just mentioned a team that does, but I generally don't have a team that's got like Jawan Jennings, or DeAndre Hopkins, those types of guys just like waiting to be used. And so if I had a QB go down, I don't have that backfill. So I need the QB3 option. And the other one is like the bye weeks. Like you got 2 bye weeks. So to answer your question, yes, I like to have a QB3. I want them to be very cheap though.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's fair. I've struggled with this every year because I really do think it is a super fine line between making sure you have enough depth, but like you just said, not too much to the point where it's like, all right, I'm just wasting a bunch of roster value right now on guys I'm never playing. And like how can I shift that value into either better future prospects or better starting lineup points? Because it's either like points or future value is how each player is handled. So yeah, I mean, with the QB3 thing specifically came to be a issue with a few of my teams this year, and I'm like, I might want to rethink how I'm building them next year. Another
really quick, another interesting thing that you can do when you have that QB3 is when someone's DAT goes down, maybe you're there waiting to be the person that they trade with, and you can kind of capitalize on some value, whether you're sending them a Geno Smith or you are giving them your top end player for your top end quarterback for their DAC or things like that you can't do if you only have 2 quarterbacks.
Yeah. It does just increase your flexibility, which is a good point because we kind of go back to this regardless of the topic, but having a lot of flexibility with your roster is more important than almost anything else you can do. And so another kind of team building, where do I want to put my value thing that we kind of touched on a little bit earlier, that I'm curious to see how the community at large shifts after this year, is a lot has been talked about this year being like the year of the running back. After years of like running backs don't matter, 0 RB, etc. Like robust running back drafters were very rewarded with this year. We mentioned Mixon, Kamara, Henry, all these different running backs that are
except for the redrafter that took CMC 101.
Yeah, CMC 101 hasn't really worked out, but in general, and there's a bunch of different stats that point to this. I think there's something like 8 running backs are over 18 points a game and only 2 receivers, or, I don't know the exact numbers, but generally speaking, running backs are scoring a lot more points than receivers this year. And personally, it is going to be more of an emphasis for me going forward. Like you had talked about how I don't like to roster like the Gibbs and Bijan and Breeses. And I generally want to make sure I have like 2 or 3 good running backs and then a couple dart throws on my contenders. And I am thinking of like shifting that more of like now I kind of want to have 4 or 5 good running backs going into
You can put them
next
in the
year.
flex.
Yeah, put them in the like. Generally speaking, I want to start a James Conner in my flex over whatever his like Darnell Mooney or whatever his equivalent is as a receiver. And I just think that I'm going to be on the lookout in the offseason, like we talked about in the offseason. These younger receivers carry a lot more value than the older running backs. How can I convert my Devontae Smith into Joe Mixon plus, Alvin Kamara plus? I think that's going. I think a lot of the trades I'm going to be looking at after the year, maybe when rookie fever hits during rookie draft time, April, May. I think that's going to be a move that I'm going to be looking to make on a lot of my contenders. And I'm just kind of curious do you think the community is going to react that way as well? Do you think like Mixon and Kamara are going to be harder to acquire this offseason than they were this past offseason?
100% yes. I mean, this past offseason, people were trading away the Derrick Henrys, Joe Mixons, Alvin Kamara's, Aaron Jones type for just a second round pick. Now, they were kind of doing that with like Mike Evans types as well, maybe Amari Cooper, but it didn't work out as well for those receivers as it's worked out for the running backs. I don't think that we're getting those running backs for seconds anymore, maybe not even 2 seconds. Now, it's very easy to say that as we sit here heading into week 13 when points are everything.
Yeah.
And they're the only thing in some regards. When we get to March, April, May, when everybody cares only about value and age and having a sick roster, and what does KTC say, things like that is what people are talking about, then like these running backs are only going to lose value. So like if they're worth a late first today, it's probably early second and a mid to late second later, maybe just an early second.
Well, and I think a narrative that's going to give us a buying opportunity is, we've dabbled a little bit in 2025 rookie talk, but we haven't gone in depth about it. But one of the points that you've made on past shows is like, man, this is the year that the running back position gets replenished in Dynasty. There's going to be so many good rookies. There's different draft analysts like Dane Brugler, Matt Miller, that predicting 10 to 12 running backs on day 2 this year, second and third round grades. So, right now Joe Mixon's expensive, but if the Texans draft a running back in the 3rd round, now all of a sudden you can get Mixon for maybe a mid-second this offseason. Trade that new rookie running back for Joe Mixon, because everyone's gonna like Trey Benson was going over James Conner in startup drafts after April's draft. So you could have a situation where you're trading like the unproven rookie for the proven Joe Mixon guy this offseason. And I think that's a trade that's, very possible to do. The Vikings are another one. If the Vikings draft a running back in like round 3, it's probably unlikely that running back is immediately better than Aaron Jones or even any good at all. I mean, he could just like Marshawn Lloyd, Trey Benson. A lot of these guys just haven't done shit all year.
Yeah.
Blake Corum's another one.
We talk about like not trying to time the market. I think my personal feeling is that a lot of people say they're not trying to time the market, but like you kind of like we all kind of are. But that's another story. But one way to time the market is that we know there's going to be, call it 10 running backs drafted between rounds 1, 2, 3. So 10 different teams are adding a future NFL starting running back to their team. And it's probably going to be to these teams like the Ravens, like the Saints, like the Texans, like maybe the Packers. These teams that we really like their starting running back. And like if you were to sell your James Conner for a mid-2 in January, like trade deadline hits, you go through the playoffs, and then bam, off season. And you're like, James Conner's still worth a mid-2. You can like somebody goes to a trade calc and they're like, oh yeah, this is a pretty good deal for me. I'll take him for a mid two. Or let's use Joe Mixon because that's a kind of a more high-powered one. Trade you Joe Mixon for your 208 and 2010 or 210, something like that. That just seems like a no-brainer. You might be able to come back after the NFL draft and get Joe Mixon for just a second.
Yeah,
because like let's say they're the ones that draft Ashton Janty, or they draft Travion Henderson in the second, something like that. And whoever, like those guys that get drafted, these running backs that we're talking about are going to fall off the map. So maybe like I'm kind of talking myself into this one. Maybe they're going to be overvalued this offseason, especially early in the offseason because of what we've just been through.
It's funny. I don't know if they're going to be overvalued or undervalued, but I do think that's going to be one of the prime dynasty topics this offseason. Is like, what are we doing with all these guys that are 29 and 30 that were awesome last year and we don't trust going forward? I mean, the main thing there is like, why don't we trust them? Maybe we should, and we should stop overthinking and just, ride them till the wheels fall off type thing. And then if we're missing out on like, oh, I could have traded James Conner for a second before he fell off. All right, well, that mid-second probably would have busted. Like, who cares?
The old adage was that you were getting
first.
Yeah, the old adage is that you were getting rid of these running backs because the wheels were going to fall off and they were going to just start sucking. Well, they've been really good recently. So now it might be that it's not because they're going to be bad. It's because they're about to get their job taken from them by a rookie running back. Now, maybe the rookie running back sucks, but if the Texans were to draft the second or third round running back, the hype train around it will be that Joe Mixon and this new guy will be in a split backfield. And at that point, we probably could go back into a bye period of the Joe Mixons, the Alvin Kamara's, the Derrick Henrys, because there's probably going to be one last hoorah for those guys where they give you one more RB1 type season.
Well, and like you mentioned earlier, outside of CMC, we really haven't dealt with any high-profile running back injuries.
Yeah.
So, that's unlikely to repeat again next year. Some of these guys are going to get hurt, probably before the end of this year is even over. Hopefully not. But, yeah, so I do think that what you said is true. Like, people could just – generally, we tend to think, okay, whatever happened last year is always going to continue happening, whether it's, certain archetypes of players breaking out or disappointing. And there could be some overconfidence in guys like Mixon, Kamara, Conner not getting hurt or staying healthy going forward. All right. What else do you want to hit on today?
So I have one league that you're in where I've got a really weird situation that went down, and it's kind of a game theory discussion and interested in your feedback, and it might be something that could be applicable to other people in other leagues. So I've got a team that I came into the year where I was like, I think I'm going to get the 101. I've got a for sure tanker. And then there came up to be a point where Puka became available. I had two what I deemed to be like kind of like late ones, and I traded the two late ones and I think a late second for Puka. And I wouldn't say it was like a hammer great trade, but like I felt like it was a solid value trade where I got Puka. So my team became kind of like still, I for sure thought I was a top 2 or 3 pick. Well, some of my players just I had Bo Nix, like he just kind of hit. I just had a couple guys that performed well. My team I was still a tanker, full on tanker. Then the team kept winning random games. There's no media in this league. Yeah, and I kept winning random games on accident. I got to 6-5. I got to 6-5, and my pick was going to be like 104, 105 because I just couldn't. There was nobody to really sell to. The guys that I would have to sell were guys like Puka. I'd have to sell like a Herbert or a Nix. Like I didn't have like a T. Higgins. I could have tried to sell, but there wasn't really any buyers. So like my options were kind of running dry, and so I'm 6-5. There's a few other teams, including you're like 8-3. Like there were some teams that were at 7-4, things like that. And so I got into a position where there were a couple tankers that were just desperate to shed points because they're in
Yeah.
a little runoff for the 101. Like, we've got a couple teams that don't even have a full roster of bench players. They've got like 12 players overall because they're tanking so hard. So
Fucking Jacob.
yeah, so I kind of saw some rumblings in the chat about there not being anybody to sell to, and so I was like, sure, I'll like throw my name in the hat to try to contend. I'm 6-5. I did the math. I would have to win out, and then I might need a little bit of help from someone else to lose, but the odds are pretty good that somebody will lose a matchup that I need. And so if I were to win out, I would get in the playoffs. So I just put into the chat that send me offers. I'm not going to counter any offers. I'm only going to accept or reject. And if I do this, I'm going to do all the trades at once because I don't want to like accept one trade and then people leverage it against me that I'm a contender now, and then I have no flexibility. So I started receiving offers. I had several seconds. I had my first, which was probably going to be non-playoff. So I sent out to the chat that I was willing to receive some offers. One of the things that I wanted was send me a running back that's worth more than a second for a second, because I knew that these guys were all like trying to shed points. So I got an offer of Ramondre Stevenson for what's probably going to be the 204, 205. That's pretty good value to me. So I was like, if I got into a situation where I don't make the playoffs, can I turn around and trade Stevenson for a second one day? I think I probably can. I think that's probably pretty doable. So I held on to that one. Then the other one that came through was Nico for my first in 25, my first in 26, a second, a third, and a fourth. To me, Nico has a case to be like wide receiver 3.
Yeah.
In fact, he probably should be wide receiver 3. So I was like, all right, if I get like just like Stevenson, if I get into a situation where I missed the playoffs and I got to shed Nico, I can probably recover this value pretty easily. Maybe I can sell him for more. I don't even really want to trade him though, because I think he's awesome. So I'll probably just hold on to him and just say that's a pretty fair value trade. So I went ahead and just accepted both of those trades. And now I don't have my first anymore. And I don't have my 26 first anymore. I've got some seconds. I've got Jonathan Brooks. I've got Michael Penix. My starting lineup now is pretty good after adding those two. And I obliterated my opponent this last week. And now I've got to win 2 more games to get into the playoffs. And then I need a little bit of help. But I found it to be interesting to go from a tanker to a contender, but I probably still won't make the playoffs. And so it was just a weird situation that kind of came up. But I say all this to say, in the way I would like to hear your feedback on it, we shouldn't just be looking at our own 25 first. Like it's untouchable because it's mine. Like if I got into the draft and I was sitting on the 105 and somebody offered me the 105, my 26 first, which I hope to be a playoff, and a second for Nico, I'd smash it. So I think both people win on that trade because he's going to probably now be the 101. And I would say a fair market trade. I would probably have paid. I probably value Nico maybe like a second more, maybe even probably at least a second more.
Yeah.
And so point being that I think that just because you're a tanker and doesn't mean your first should be completely off limits. And now I've got a shot to maybe make the playoffs. And I've never done anything like this before. It's very unconventional, but I thought it was an interesting situation. And I was hoping to be able to get one more trade done because I still have 3 seconds. I still have Jonathan Brooks. I still have Michael Penix. But I didn't want to make any irrational trade or pay up too much because there's still a very strong chance that I don't make the playoffs.
Yeah, and I think you did it correctly. Where first of all, I definitely agree that there should be no player or pick that's untouchable. I fucking hate that concept in Dynasty. Nothing like annoys me more than when, like, and I'm kind of known in our little group chat and circle of people we play with as like the opposite. Like people are like, oh, no one will trade Justin Jefferson or Josh Allen. And I'm like, I will. Like,
Yeah.
pay me enough and you can have my Josh Allen share. I think people kind of look at first like that too, especially non-contending. If you're going to miss the playoffs and you're going to have the 104 or 105, a lot of people are like, oh, that's off limits. I want to get the next Malik Neighbors or whoever, CJ Stroud. And all those picks and players have a price. Like instead of that, you could have drafted, Bryce Young or someone that like a pick that didn't work out. And people kind of value those picks like they're automatically hits. Like, oh, I got the 104, that's worth 2 or 3 firsts. Well, not really. Not until that player actually comes to fruition. So if I'm gonna trade that pick, if I'm gonna trade my non-playoff first, I want a cornerstone player. I'm not trading that pick for a player that might be worth half as much next year. And Nico Collins fits that criteria perfectly. Like he's definitely a top 5 or 6 dynasty wide receiver. Like you said, you can make a case that he's up there at number 3. I think that's very reasonable. And if you're going to go this route, I think you did it correctly where you have Justin Herbert, you have Bo Nix, who's kind of established himself as like a stable, solid starter. So you have Herbert and Nix, and then you have Nico Collins, Puka Nacua, Marvin Harrison, and Trey McBride. Those 6 players are an awesome foundation, whether you want to punt next year, whether you want to add to them and compete, like you said, is your goal. It just leaves a lot of flexibility for how you want to move going forward, even if you don't have your first.
Yeah, it's flexibility built into players and not picks, which is a little bit uncomfortable. For sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And like, one thing that I've done a good job of this year is like, I'm just not trading my future picks, even on a contender, unless it's a great deal. And I think a couple of these deals, like you said, send me a guy that's worth more than this pick and I'll do it. It's got to be like an obvious value win currently for me to even consider it. And because generally I'm just not trying to trade picks, but in a situation like this, I can see why you did it. And I do think that the point that we're trying to make here is keep an open mind and don't have like this rigid structure of, because keeping an open mind in Dynasty is really the best way to improve your team long term. Take some educated gambles, things like that. And it's funny because in this league that we're talking about, if you remember this, this is the second year of this league. Last year, me and you both did 1-year punts to start the league.
And really quick, you and I both had awful drafts. I feel like a lot of things. It wasn't just like bad drafts. It was just like a lot of the guys we got just flailed. Like it just did not go well.
Yeah, it didn't work out. It was definitely just a poorly executed plus bad luck 1-year punt. Like it was an
auction. It was an auction startup.
Yeah. And so I remember both of us talking and we're like, man, we might not be contending for years.
Yeah.
And so that's when I reached out to you and I was like, all right, fuck it. Let's try and make a trade here where I'm going to give you some of my extra picks. You give me Nico and T and Aaron Rodgers as my QB2. And I'll just take a shot at contending. Why not? And
it ended up being a very fair trade. Like you got now Nico hitting really hard probably made me lose it a little bit. I think that there was a couple I made some subsequent trades after that, which helped, but it really took you from being like, we were like positioning for the 101, 102. And then you became a guy like you were 8 I think maybe you're 8-3 or 8-4 now, but
8-4 now. Yeah.
I think it kind of goes back to the same point of don't be so rigid on like, this is my path. And like, I can't deter from it at all. Like be flexible and be willing to kind of roll with what the market and what the value is in your league. And in my situation, like I'm pretty confident that I can sell Stevenson back for a 2 at some point. Like if I lose either of these next 2 weeks, I'm out of the playoffs. Like I'm not going to make the playoffs. So I'm going to be going into the offseason with no first round pick on a team that missed the playoffs. So that's going to be pretty uncomfortable. But it's a league that it's a pretty sharp league, but I think that there's a lot of movement that's going to happen throughout that league. And there's people that are pretty active. So that's another reason that I felt pretty comfortable with doing something like that.
And like I said about some of your cornerstone guys, like you take Herbert, Nico, Puka, Harrison, McBride, and even Nix. Like those 6 guys are combining worth what, 15 first, something like that. So I mean that's those 6 guys alone are 80% of like a full roster value and value. So you have a lot of options in terms of trading them for 3 good starters or more picks, etc.
Give a little bit more depth. Yeah. So one thing I would caution someone, if you are sitting there and you're like, I'm probably going to miss the playoffs, but if I win these next 2 and that guy loses and I'll get in, I need to upgrade my team. Okay. I'm going to do kind of like what Todd did. I'm going to make a big move. What I would caution you is that I would not go out and be buying a Derrick Henry or a Christian McCaffrey or any of those guys on a team like this. I would be only buying a player that I think is not only going to hold value, but I believe in and I think might gain value. So like, for example, for me, that's a Nico or like a Puka, like a wide receiver that you're going in thinking like this guy's a stud and he can help me win. And I think his value is going to hold because you go in and you sell that potentially non-playoff first for the Derrick Henry or the CMC. And maybe you get some other stuff too. Like maybe you trade that non-playoff first for Henry and Cup. Like that doesn't sound that bad, really. But like you didn't miss the playoffs and you're sitting there with a guy that in the offseason people were like, I'll give you a second for Derrick Henry. I'll give you a second for Cooper Kupp. Like you got wrecked on that trade. So I would just caution if you're going to do this, it's only for plus value. So like Stevenson for a second, or for a guy that is going to maintain that value, like a top 2 round startup pick.
Like we Brian and I did like a mid-season startup league a couple months ago, 6 weeks ago, whatever. And I think Nico went at like the 1-2 turn, which is about right, So I mean, that's the type. Those type of players are generally worth 3+ firsts, and you got them for 2 firsts and a second. So that's when you want to make that move. And one other point that kind of ties into this whole discussion about like maybe flipping team direction mid-season or late in the season. One thing I think is important to remember. Now, there's going to be exceptions to this, but generally a bad dynasty team is not as far away from contending as most people think. Like
that's a great point. I can't tell you how many times this offseason I dogged a roster of mine or I dogged this team that we've been talking about. And multiple times in the offseason, you were like, I don't think you're as far away as you think. You said that multiple times. And
I'm the king of that.
Basically every time I was like, I think you're just trying to like gas me up a little bit. And now that I'm getting further into the season on some of these teams that were really bad rebuilds, I've got one that I'm like embarrassed of. Shout out to Variance Bowl 3 group. Like that team is that, but like I got a lot of firsts. Like that team is going to get turned around. So I think you make a great point that like you're not as far away as you really think you are.
Yeah, like okay, so here's one trade that I'm very happy. Trade sequence that I'm very happy with. My worst team. Brian's in this league. You're not. League named Wannabe Experts, fittingly enough. And it was one of the first leagues that started in our group, Twitter group chat like 2-3 years ago. I made a lot of dumb win now trades, didn't work out. And so I kind of did what we don't really like to do anymore and stripped it to the studs, like traded everything for picks. And I showed you this roster at the beginning of the year and you're like, yo, I'm sorry to say, Matt, you are literally not competing for like 3 more years. And I was like, I really think I'm like 2 years away, but point well taken. But so during the rookie draft, my goal is to always take some like we talked about, take some educated gambles. And one trade that I wanted to do a lot during rookie drafts, and I did it in this league and one other one, was I traded Caleb Williams to our friend Jacob Sanderson for Drake May and his 25 first, which he has a very strong team. I was very confident that was going to be a late first, and now it looks like it's going to be a bye week first. But May and Caleb, the gap closed completely, and now they're considered interchangeable to the point where a couple weeks ago, Jacob prefers Drake May now. I traded him May straight up for Caleb. So I got Caleb back and I got his bye week first. And that's like the type of, and that's the end of like our trade sequence. So I just picked up a bye week first for nothing, basically, over the span of 6 months. And those are the type of gambles that I wanted to try and make on my worst teams. Because, like, what am I going to do? Lose value? Okay, I already have the worst value team in the league. That's not really going to hurt it anymore. I need to, take some chances to double my value. And that's not like doubling it, but those are the types of swings that I'm looking at making. And this year reinforced that to me, where like people get so impatient with absolute blue chip prospects as rookies in the first 4 to 6 weeks of the season. Like Drake May was sitting behind Brissett the first few weeks, and like he was very acquirable. People were like, man, that situation's a fucking disaster. No offensive line, terrible coaching. And Drake May comes in, and he's not lighting the world on fire or anything, but he's running a lot like he did in college. He looks pretty good. And it's been enough to build his value back up, where now he's like 2 or 3 firsts. Similar situation with Caleb. Caleb has had a rough rookie year. It's been well documented. But during his rough rookie year, every few weeks, he's put together like a 330-yard, 2-touchdown game where he's making all the highlight play. And people were like calling him a bust and shit, like as recently as 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago.
And it just made a great buy low opportunity where I'm like, I don't understand what people think they're seeing with Caleb. Like, to me, this is not Bryce Young's rookie year where he gave you literally no reason to believe. Like, Caleb's showing us the flashes. It just poor coaching, a bunch of shit going bad around him. So there's always those type of moves that we're going to be able to make, next year. Let's say Ashton Genty gets off to a slow start. First 3 weeks of the season, he's getting like 8 carries a game for 40 yards. All of a sudden, a guy that was worth 3 firsts this offseason, maybe you can get him for like a first and second or 2 firsts or whatever the trade ends up being, Maybe you trade him Gibbs and you get Genty and a first back because Gibbs is producing at that moment. So there's always going to be these like pockets of value that you can go get. Yeah,
I think one of them that's happening right now is Jonathan Brooks. Coming into the season, people were like, I was definitely ahead of the train, was saying like, all right, he's like running back 10, 12. As soon as we get one good game from him, he could be like RB 6 or 7. And now Hubbard gets re-signed. It's definitely uncomfortable. You just talked about some hypotheticals.
Yeah.
It's easy. It's easier to talk about hypotheticals than it is like now we're looking at like a real scenario with Jonathan Brooks where his value is kind of cratering because of Hubbard, and he comes in his first game and he gets 2 carries. And now you look at him and you say, oh, well, like I don't want anything to do with him anymore. And I think that's probably a buy opportunity. Like they didn't just draft him in the second round to never give him a shot. Now, is he going to be like an 80-20 bell cow? Probably not. But let's go through the entire NFL, and there's not that many 80-20 guys anymore. So, yeah, I think Jonathan Brooks is a pretty good example. He's not like on the Caleb Williams level of value, but as far as like a young guy that people have just kind of discarded, Jonathan Brooks is a pretty good example there.
Yeah, and the other one that stands out to me that's definitely going to cost more than Brooks is like, and I haven't really seen him sold low, so maybe nobody is worried about him, but like Rome Odunze has not had a very good rookie year, but similar to Caleb, he's also shown a lot of flashes of the high upside that got him drafted top 10 overall. they fired Shane Waldron. The offense looks better.
Similar to Caleb, they got rid of their shithead offensive coordinator, Shane Waldron.
Yeah. So, maybe Odunze is a guy that you can go acquire right now for cheaper than he would have been a couple months ago. And maybe he does actually follow the JSN arc, where JSN is now finally blossoming into the player that everybody expected a year and a half ago. And the people that were patient with JSN or bought in at the right time now are getting rewarded with like a huge value increase over the past month. That looks like it's sustainable going forward. Like JSN does really look like he's going to be in that, I don't know, wide receiver 10 to 12 range or whatever.
Yeah, if you were a rebuild and you had a very strong teams first, maybe they're a buy, like they're in contention for a buy. They're not a lock for a buy, but
3 or 4.
Would you trade that first for Rome Odunze?
Yeah, I would.
Okay, I've got a situation on one of my worst rosters ever where I've got someone's very late first. I think actually I've got 4 first, and one of them I think is going to be the buy. I might offer that first for Rome straight up.
Yeah, that's the type of trade that I, would be willing to do, because it's really the same gamble or the same bet, right? You're still betting on future production and value increase, whether it's a rookie or Rome Odunze. So
they threw the ball 47 times this past week, but he did get 10 targets. I saw that he has the second most uncatchable air yards on the season behind Calvin Ridley. So part of that, maybe Caleb's not playing very well. So that's part of it. And, who knows if those uncatchable air yards turn around. But they are looking for him, and they are getting the ball to him downfield. So, yeah, I think Rome is probably a guy that we should be looking to buy. And I think a very late first. I think I might go send that offer.
Yeah, and it's funny, one other guy that kind of fits in the same bucket, but his rookie year was good enough that people don't want to lower his value, is Sam Laporta. But I wonder if the Lions just finish out this year and Laporta is just like their number 4 option, and doesn't do a whole lot the rest of the year in the playoffs. I kind of wonder how cheap he's going to start getting in the offseason, where people are like, oh, his rookie year was kind of a fluke. Those are the type of guys that you always want to be on the lookout of, when it's not trending well, how much of a discount from his normal price can I actually get right now? Can I get Laporta for an early second and some change? Probably not, but you never know. People might just start getting that frustrated. So
I traded away on a rebuild. I traded away Kyler and Eckler for Dak and Laporta.
Oh yeah, that's a perfect example. Yeah.
So I think that's plays like that. I think a lot of times, and I do this too, is whenever you're trying to trade I'm trying to trade my Kyler for a Dak plus, you can easily get stuck into I need a first back, and not everybody wants to move their first. Can I go and get a player equivalent? And that's kind of what I was looking to do. Okay, I got Dak and a first for Kyler essentially, but the first name is Laporta.
Yeah. That's a great example of what we're talking about here.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to do a 4-round startup mock. It'll be Matt, myself, and Brian doing that. We'll either release that either after Thanksgiving. I'm not sure yet. Maybe over the weekend. We'll release that 4-round startup mock. That one might be a 2-hour marathon episode, so that we can get to kind of touch on a lot of the players. So be on the lookout for that. This one was fun, Matt. Thanks for joining.